When I think about text, I view it more as streets. It's meant to slow us down, to consider, to reflect upon the text. So I try to design a palace to make me slow down.
This is Bible Memory Goal. My name is Josh, and you just heard from Ronald Johnson. He is a memory athlete, host of the Craft of Memory podcast, and we've already had him on this channel twice before to talk about some very interesting memory techniques that have been very popular with many of you watching. Ronald brings a very unique perspective to this conversation because he has one foot in the memory competition world and one foot in the scripture memory world. He's familiar with a lot of techniques that work in this world that perhaps aren't even known about in the scripture memory world, and that's what he's going to be talking about today. Now that we've laid the foundation, let's dive into this conversation with Ronald about his experience in memory competitions.
So when I look at the human memory at work, one word that comes to my mind is that it's a beautiful thing. So just as one can look at the Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon and say, this is beautiful, when I see the human memory on display, it shows me the beauty of God, of how amazing He is and what the human memory can do. So the first thing, how I got into memory techniques and memory competitions, is once I saw it, I was fascinated. And then we know that God is the source of all beauty. So when you see these beautiful things, you can know that it comes from the one who is the foundation and the source of all beauty.
I think you have a very unique perspective, both living in both this memory competition world as well as, your love for scripture memory and obviously your passion for just the beauty that God created with our mind. I'm curious what kind of techniques are currently being used, maybe in the memory side world, that we're not either aware of or fully taking advantage of in the scripture memory world.
So one method I would like to point out would be the Katie method, and this is from Katie Kermode. And what she does is that she puts people in locations. These are fixed, designated people in each location, and she does this for the majority of her memory disciplines. And you may be asking the question, why would you put people in locations? Well, there are some things that are more difficult to memorize, especially abstract concepts. So if you had like happiness, I can't touch happiness. I can't hold it in my hand, put it in my pocket, or touch it like a concrete physical object. But if I had a person in a location, I can imagine that person being happy. So you can apply this to text. If you have a more abstract passage, you can use a fixed person within that location to sort of make that thing which is abstract more concrete. A second technique I would like to point out is known as the Nina colored light method. And this is, so Nina Kalyan is a memory athlete from India. And she uses this technique when memorizing words because you have to be very specific. If you miss one aspect, one small detail, you can lose all of your points. So like, so one thing she does is that she casts colored light on the image to represent a certain ending. So like you have shun or ing or ent, or you have all of these various endings. So she has a particular color that represents a particular ending. So when she sees that colored light on the image, she knows that word ends with this particular ending. So let's say you're memorizing scripture and you're having difficulty with certain words, or you're confusing it with, I don't know, if or and or but. You can designate certain colors to certain words. So whenever you see this particular color on that image or on that locus, you know that it starts with that particular word. Or the third is sort of a way of thinking, which is from Simon Reinhart. He is a very well-respected memory athlete. And usually in memory teaching, there's this emphasis upon the strange and the bizarre and the absurd. You have to make the images wild. You have to make it strange. You have to do all of these things. And one thing that Simon Reinhart pointed out is that when everything becomes bizarre, when everything becomes strange, nothing is bizarre and nothing is strange. So you don't always have to use these strange or bizarre images when you're encoding text. Another thing that he argues is that one could use logic, reasons, and relationships. So, for example, let's say you wanted to memorize apple, and let's say your locus or location was a sofa, and let's say there were red patterns on that sofa. You can just make a simple relationship between the redness in the couch and the redness of the apple. Or let's say you had to memorize an egg, and your locus was a wall, and there was like a small hole in the wall. You can make the relationship: the wall is white, the egg is white, the hole in the wall is small, the egg is small. You don't have to have these strange and bizarre images all the time. Just that simple relationship or that simple logic is sufficient enough for one to recall that image. So, and also it reduces the amount of cognitive load when memorizing, because using a lot of imagery can be very, or at times, taxing to the mind.
Yeah.
And the last technique that I would like to point out is one from Lance Shearhart, who currently holds the world record for spoken numbers. He puts an emphasis upon linking. So, and what do I mean by this? Is that he would argue it's not sufficient enough for you to have the imagery, to imagine the imagery in front of the locus, but you want to have the imagery interact with the locus, in the sense that when you go to the locus, you can infer the image. And that's based on linking. So I'll give you an example. So in Lance Shearhart's system, every image leaves a unique imprint. It has a unique characteristic that is left upon an image. So let's say you have a fork and a tire. So just so you can imagine, the tire has 4 holes in it, and that holes refers to the fork. So let's say you forgot the fork, but you remember the tire. But if you look closely at the tire, you will see the holes. And when you see the holes, you will infer the previous image, which is the fork, because you know that the fork always leaves a unique imprint upon an image. So thinking about linking, thinking about how can you infer images is another useful technique that I think can be used in the memorization of scripture.
Wow, yeah, all of those are fascinating. I'm not even sure I can remember all of them as I'm sitting here. I should have been taking notes. I mean, even with that last one, the idea of linking. One of the things that I've learned over time of me forgetting things that I've memorized as I've put them in different locations, is a lot of times. You're right. I don't feel like I have to have the most bizarre image in order to remember a particular word or phrase or whatever it is. However, if the image that I have for one part doesn't thoroughly connect to the other, like it's just like, oh, and then he put the fork on the tire, like there's not, like you said, there's nothing to infer that connection, and so it easily gets lost in my mind. Whereas if there is some very intimate connection, the fork was jammed in the tire and it left these four holes, that connection is so much stronger and allows me to remember. I'm assuming that's kind of what you're talking about. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, correct. So
Okay.
what I mean is, let's say, planted by streams of water. A simple thing would be having water on the fridge. So when you look at the fridge, you see the water. When you think of the water, your your mind goes back to the text. Rather than just seeing it in front of the locus, have it interact with the locus or leave some imprint upon the locus itself.
Yeah, I see. I think I see what you're saying. Yeah, and so the image itself becomes almost part of the text that you're memorizing as you're going along.
Exactly.
So part of what I guess the trouble that I've had, or not the trouble, I think it's more just the realizations that I've had as I've gone along over the past couple of years, is that I love the memory palace or the mind palace method for its organization. That's just the way that God wired me. I love organization. I love things being in their place, and I like knowing that 2 Timothy chapter 3 is on the third level of this house that I remember going to for vacation once. And then being able to walk around that, like, that is very attractive to me. But I've also learned and had conversations with a lot of people who have reiterated the fact that memory palace in and of itself doesn't seem to lend itself for text, for like word for word memorization, or at least it's just harder. And maybe I'm doing it wrong. So I'm open to any ideas that you have. But like, what is it about doing? How is it that I see these memory athletes that are memorizing, let's say, the whole book of Harry Potter, or something else that is very, very text heavy? Are they still using the memory palace? And if so, like, is there something that they're doing slightly different than what I'm doing that's making a big difference?
So one thing I would say is that they tend to use intuition a lot, and what I mean by that is, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? A lot of the times we want to try to come up with the best story, the best image that correlates to the text. But what you'll find in the memory arts is that often good storytelling is bad storytelling. It's somewhat
Mm.
paradoxical, but I would say that y- the key is to sort of simplify it, that you don't have to have an image for every single word.
Mm.
Try to have an image for, uh, let's say, the keywords, or even just the concept of the text.
Yeah.
And I would say that is one thing that would be helpful, and also it's just a matter of practice. I mean, it's hard. It's hard at first, but the more you practice, the more quick images come to mind, and it's learning just to trust in your intuition. So, like, when I think of cheerleader, the first thing that comes to my mind is like Amanda or Gabrielle. It it's just the first thing that comes to my mind. Some people will say, well, it doesn't really have a relationship. Just use the first thing that comes to your mind. Don't stress out too much. Just trust in your intuition, trust in your memory, and trust in those connections that come into your mind, is what I would say.
And that's probably the number one reason why I can't use your memory palace stuff and you can't use mine, because Amanda would be probably one of the furthest words that I would associate with cheerleader. But that, yeah, like for me, the number 19 is always my wife, because her birthday is on April 19th. And so, that correlation doesn't really exist for other people, but it does for me. And I will always remember, anytime I see my wife in my mind's palace, I think of the number 19. And that usually, signifies verse 19 for me or something like that. As I've been following along with your journey, Ronald, online with your new podcast and all that stuff, I've recognized, and it wasn't hard to recognize, that you seem to have a love for urban planning, right? And especially urban design and all that stuff. You've written about something that I think you called walkable journeys. And it's this idea of really slowing down instead of speeding up. And so my question to you is, what have you learned about different approaches to the traditional mind palace that have been able to help you as you've continued in your own memory journey?
Yeah. So one thing I learned is that there's a difference between memorizing for memory sports and memorizing for text or for study. And this relationship, you find similarities in urban planning, and particularly when you think about traffic engineering. So there's actually a difference between a road and a street. Sometimes perhaps we haven't really thought of the difference, but a road is designed to get you from point A to point B. So the way the road is designed is that it tends to be very straight. There are not as many curves. You don't really see any trees. There's a large path that is clear, and it's designed for speed and efficiency. And then when you look at a street, street is meant to slow you down. So with the road, you have wider lanes, and with the streets, they tend to be more narrow. You would have trees overhanging. You would have traffic calming features like speed bumps, and even the way the curves are designed is it's meant to slow you down, to actually walk, to get out of your car and to visit all of the surrounding stores and restaurants and so forth. Two different ways of thinking. So when it comes to memory palace design, I would say that memory sports is like designing memory palaces for getting from point A to point B. However, when I think about text, I view it more as streets. It's meant to slow us down, to consider, to reflect upon the text. And one of the things that we find especially in America, in the way our cities are designed, is what traffic engineers called stroads. And what that is that you have a combination of streets and roads, so that it's neither a street nor a road, but it's a combination of the two, which really doesn't work. And I think sometimes when thinking about the memory palace, we're applying memory sport techniques where we should sort of leave them for memory sports, whereas there's certain textual-based techniques that should be reserved for textual-based memorizing. So one of the things I learned is that or at least for me, is I try to design a palace to make me slow down, just like those speed bumps, just like those narrow lanes, just like the trees overhanging is causing me to slow down. And one of the things I do is I put symbolism throughout my memory palaces. So, for example, let's say you're memorizing a text on the death of Christ, his crucifixion. So let's say you encoded that passage in a room. You can have on the wallpaper, you can have like bubbles, like images of bubbles, and perhaps bubbles are coming out of the wall. And you may be asking, why are there bubbles in the room? Because then it reminds you of Jonah. You see how Jonah went into the belly of the fish, and he went into the sea. And we can think on the cross. Jesus said, "Can you be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" And you think in the manner in which he died, as if he was drowning. So as you're walking into that locus with that encoded text, you have this additional symbolism of the bubbles that makes you think about other texts, like the book of Jonah. Because one thing about urban planning is that they think about social interaction. It was once said that we first shape our cities and then our cities shape us, is because they understood how they design a city will shape human behavior in our interaction with each other. So the way we tend to design in America is that we have our closed garage doors. We have, like, you can't walk to a grocery store. You have to use a car. It's the way the zoning codes are. Some of the interactional elements. So those are some of the ways the concepts of urban planning has influenced the way I think about memory palace design. So those are just some examples. I can keep on going on, but yeah, those are some things I think about.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is so poignant, that idea of designing your memory palace to slow down, creating those speed bumps in some way to make you stop and think. And even what you said there, one of the reasons, and I've talked about this with a number of people in our community, one of the reasons that I love memorizing alongside, let's say, a Bible study that I'm doing, or a passage that we're going through in church, is that a lot of times the symbolism that you're talking about isn't always readily apparent to me, right? As I read through the text, sometimes it takes somebody, a teacher or a commentary or something like that, to bring that connection to light. And so when I am going through and memorizing a text while simultaneously doing a Bible study, or while simultaneously going through that text in church, that gives me a lot of that material to draw from, that does allow me to create what I would call those hyperlinks, right? I live in the world of online, just linking and all that stuff. And so when I think of that stuff, I think of hyperlinks, where the Bible links to itself so many different times, where a lot of times the things that Jesus says harkens back to the stories of Jacob, of Isaac, of Jonah, of all of these people. And being able to draw that in is one aspect of building a memory palace that I think is so beautiful. You can add this stuff in that maybe you're not going to say, but as I visit that locus, as you say, that position in my memory palace, I can see that connection. Like I can see that, let's say, that whale or those bubbles or something of that sort. I think that is really cool.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to mention is that sometimes when people talk about memory palaces, they say that they will come to a point where they will forget the memory palace and they would just remember the lines. It's sort of as that there will come a point where the memory palace sort of fades away and you just have the lines. And the way I design memory palaces is that I want to be able to keep them and remember them due to this symbolism. The one thing is I want to create a palace in such a way that that I want to dwell in the locations.
Wasn't that just a fascinating conversation? If you want to learn more about Ronald's podcast, you can just search Craft of Memory on your favorite podcast player. I'll also have a link to the podcast, to his website, to his Instagram, all in the description of this video, so go find him there. And if you want to watch either of the other 2 interviews that I've already done with Ronald that are on this channel, you can watch those right here next. God bless.